Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm John Wells. I'm the interim director of the Residential College and a historian of 19th century America. And I am so glad that you decided to join us this afternoon for our annual marquee event, the Robertson Lecture. And I was reviewing Dean Robertson's career, and he really was quite an amazing person. I was looking again at his biography, since I haven't been director in quite a few years now. And I was reminded that although he retired as a faculty member in the RC and in the English department in 1983, he had lived a pretty remarkable and impressive life. That included, of course, not only a Ph.D. in English from the University of Michigan and a long and distinguished career as the first director of the RC, an associate dean for LS&A, and as a professor, but also he served 4 years of military service during World War II and was a major in the European theater during the war, so pretty remarkable. He was, in fact, the first director of the RC from 1967 to 1973, and today, with this lecture, we honor his legacy. We are very happy and lucky here today to have Cydney K. Seigerman as a Ph.D. candidate in the Integrative Conservation and Anthropology program at the University of Georgia, where they work with Dr. Don Nelson and are a member of the Human Environmental Change Lab. Cydney is a NSF Graduate Research Fellow and a research scholar in Brazil. Their research incorporates methods from the critical social sciences, natural sciences, and theater and performance studies to explore human, technology, environment relations. Their dissertation work explores how socionatural processes shape and are shaped by the lived experience of water insecurity in northeastern Brazil. Before pursuing their PhD, Cydney studied chemistry and Spanish language and literature at the University of Michigan, graduating from the Residential College, as well as
with our lovely Katie Gass, who
Yes.
is currently taking photos. Go class of 2013.
Yes, and thanks very much to Katie for organizing this talk and doing all the publicity for it. So Cydney not only graduated from the RC, but also from the Honors College. They then relocated to Madrid, Spain, where they served as a Fulbright English Teaching Assistant, studied acting at the theater school Lavandería.
Lavandería.
Oh, there you go. And ran competitively, but apparently not on the road that you see behind me.
Correct.
Yeah, too dangerous.
Yes.
Please join me in welcoming Cydney back to East Quad.
So this goes to Tanner. And just turn it off. And then we'll put this aside. So hello, everyone. There are a lot of familiar faces in the room. And first, I want to thank John for that lovely introduction, and to Katie for everything that she has done to organize my visit and put on this lecture. And it's just been wonderful to really feel come back to the RC and just feel like it's family. And it's been a wonderful 2 days already, and then tomorrow, and then I'm actually coming back on Tuesday because scheduling didn't work out, and I'll be in a Spanish class on Tuesday. And really, it's just an honor to be here, and thank you so much. And so today, I'll be talking about my journey as an interdisciplinary person. And just to give you some context of what John said, can you flip back? So this photo is from one of the roads that leads to a couple of rural communities, and I used to run on this road a lot. But during the rainy season, my first rainy season, I learned that mud can be very slippery, just like ice can be slippery. And so I usually don't go on this path anymore. So now let's go to the next slide. And so before I really begin, I wanted to take a moment. So all of you are either teaching or going to class and have come here. And now it's time to take a break, take a little bit of a rest. And so you can put that up there. And this moment of rest is inspired by the work of Tracy Hersey, who formed the NAP ministry in 2016 and refers to herself as the NAP bishop. And so she, in her work at Emory, was overwhelmed with school and taking care of her child, and found rest as this divine space to really recharge, and takes this seriously and considers rest as an act of resistance. And like so I'm Jewish, and as my stepmom mentioned the other day, in Judaism we have a day of the week, Shabbat, where we take a moment to rest. And so this ties in with the divine spirit, and really understanding that rest is essential to being a person and not doing we are machines all of the time, because we're not machines. And we really do need to value ourselves as people and that moment of rest. And so we're going to take un cochilo, una siesta, a nap. And so we're going to dim the lights. It will be 4 to 5 minutes with a track by Trisha Hersey. And you're invited to close your eyes, to breathe deeply, just relax as we take this moment of rest.
Welcome to the dream space. This is a transmission, a download, a daydream. Breathe in. Breathe in your imagination. Stay here. Stay and rest. Stay in the dream space. Our collective rest will save us. Welcome to the dream space. Another world is possible. You are enough. Our dreams are enough. This is imagination work. Imagine you have everything you need. Imagine a world with justice. Imagine a world where capitalism doesn't exist. Poverty is no longer created. Welcome to your dream space. A portal opens when we rest, when we nap, when we stop, when we sleep, when we have silence. Stay here. You can daydream. You can daydream. Welcome to the dream space. Daydream, you have everything you need. You have everything you need. You have everything you need. This is a transmission. Daydream. Daydream. Stay here. This is imagination work. This is dream work. Welcome to your dream space. You can just be. 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 You can just be.
Eyes, maybe stretch a little. We'll turn up the lights. And now we'll talk about interdisciplinarity. So let's head to this slide. So this is a reservoir that I visited in 2018 in Ceará, northeast Brazil. And while the contrast isn't great on the screen, I'm actually we're looking at the wall of the reservoir. And so where I'm standing, where we're looking, there should be water. In this year, we were at the last year of a multi-year drought from 2012 until 2018. And this reservoir is one of the largest, if not the largest, multi-use reservoirs, which means that there are multiple uses like agriculture, providing people with water for their houses, in Brazil and in South America. And so first, as we think about this scene of water, well, I'll first talk about water as an interdisciplinary medium, and then I'll talk about what I mean by interdisciplinarity and certain flavors of interdisciplinarity. And then finally, I'll share some more anecdotes about what it means to do and be interdisciplinary. And so we'll go to the next slide. First, water as an interdisciplinary medium. And first, I want to share an observation by Farhana Sultana. We'll switch slides. Who is a feminist geographer and a water expert. And she observes, the remarkable thing about water is that it seeps across all boundaries and all aspects of life, as it is simultaneously social, economic, political, institutional, cultural, spiritual, and ecological. And within her work, Dr. Sultana looks at the power dynamics that really construct how water flows, who receives water, what quality of water people have, and who makes those decisions. And thinking about all these different facets of water, I was reminded of a couple of things that I did my senior year of undergrad. So I was a chemistry major, and I was also in the RC. And being in the RC means you get to take awesome classes with wonderful professors. I was in Virginia Murphy's environmental justice literature class. And we went to one of the areas in Ann Arbor which has high levels of dioxane, which is an organic compound that has oxygen molecules, which means that it's soluble in water and means it's super difficult to get out of the water sources. And the areas where you find this dioxane are related to where there were certain plants. And thinking with an environmental justice lens, you see how the communities surrounding these areas are usually more impoverished and have higher populations of African Americans and people of color. And so in the class, we visited that site and learned about these social justice issues. Then the next semester, I had an analytical chemistry lab class. In this lab class, my lab partner and I had to come up with a project and using analytical chemistry, which means like measuring and figuring out what components are in things, for lack of a more, and it's the most general term you have, right, thing. And so I decided that it would be a great opportunity to try to come up with a method to measure dioxane levels in water, which is also very difficult to do for various chemical reasons. And our attempt was not necessarily successful for a semester project. However, this was really one of the first times that I was able to use this interdisciplinary lens without actually having that vocabulary to address a single issue, which is dioxane in water. And so as we think about that and those early connections, now I'm going to go into my current research in Ceará, northeast Brazil, where I'm looking at water security, or having access to enough water of high enough quality to live a good life, and how all of these different components are related. And so here is where I currently live. I'm actually visiting my parents here in Michigan and giving this lecture here, and then I'll be heading back to Brazil where it is much warmer. Although today, now it's like 50 degrees, it's beautiful outside. So thank you again for being inside with me. And so I live in that blue state up there in the middle of the state. And Ceará, northeast Brazil, is part of the semi-arid sertão, which means that it has high evaporation rates, low rainfall levels, and so physical water scarcity. In addition to physical water scarcity, which we can see there's also seasonality in when rain occurs. And so there's a dry season where it's almost desert-like, and then you have the rainy season, which we're starting now. And in these, while in theory we would have a dry season and a rainy season every year, there are often drought cycles where you don't have a rainy season, like the drought I mentioned from 2012 until 2018, where there's just very little rain throughout the entire year. And that means that reservoirs dry up, wells dry up, and people don't have sources of water in order to secure access to water. In addition to that, Ceará has a crystalline rock bed in their soils, which means that the majority of wells that are dug have a very high salt concentration, making it so that the main source of water is surface water in the form of reservoirs. And reservoir water, if you think about a surface area, there's a lot of evaporation. Because you have all of this surface area, you have super strong sun, and so what is the water going to do? It's going to evaporate. And so these are some of the dynamics of living here in Ceará. So now I'll just give you some perspective of where I'm living now. This is April of last year, so we're still in the rainy season, and this is the reservoir that provides water to the city that I live in, Quixaramobim, and neighboring rural communities. So we'll go, this is October, so we're already in the dry season, and you can see that this is a multi-purpose reservoir where people go and fish. And here is a motor, because at this time, the reservoir was already so low that the water level was not high enough for water to flow through gravity, and it needed to be pumped up with a motor to be able to give water to the city. So we'll keep going. This is later in the month. Keep going. November, keep going. The end of November, keep going. December, keep going. On December 8th was when the reservoir officially dried up, we'll say, and there was no more surface water. So the water company, these are people from the water company, connected this shallow, deep well called a Casimbão to provide water to the city. And this was built in 2015 during that major drought period because the reservoir dried up again, or beforehand, and it dried up again now. And so they were able to use the same infrastructure and with a lot of careful work, because electricity and water don't mix well. But in order to have a well bring water to an area, you do need to have a motor. And so the electrician on the team was very careful and was calling back and forth. And so let's keep going to see how, over the month, it continues to dry. And then the last photo, this is the day that I left. And up until now, there was maybe a rain event this past week. But when I come back, I'm expecting the reservoir to look like this or greener. So you'll notice that there's a lot of green space here. And why would you have that in a reservoir? Well, it turns out that even though there's no water to be able to bring to the city, there is subsoil water. And so right under January, if you go straight down, you'll see like a patch in between two yellowish patches. That's actually bean cultivation. So a farmer planted beans and is now cultivating those beans, taking advantage of the subsoil water, which is interesting and good in some ways. However, thinking about when this reservoir will hopefully fill up again, that means that the water quality is probably going to be very poor because we're going to have, the word is not rotten. Okay, there's words sometimes in English that I forget because I speak a lot in Portuguese. But the water quality in itself, because you'll have all this material from the water, in the water, all this grass that will then go into the system, and even right now, the water quality has a bad taste, and some people say that it's really turbid is a word? Yeah? Or no? Muddy? Muddy's a good word, yeah, sure. And so the water quality in itself is another issue in addition to lacking water. So let's keep going. And so thinking with these different processes of how water is moved out of this reservoir, and also evaporation, and also the plants that are using this water, my overall research asks the question, how are interrelated socio-natural relations negotiated to shape water stocks, water flows, and the lived experience of water insecurity? So socio-natural means to say that there are both social aspects, so thinking about political decisions, social relations between families and communities in cities, and also natural aspects. So we think about evaporation rates or rainfall levels, which if you expand beyond that, you'll think, wait a minute, even rainfall is socionatural because of human interventions with climate change that we're changing climate patterns. And so really the idea is that we can't separate the quote unquote natural, which would be like the water cycle, from the social, which are all of these political decisions, management, how people use water in their daily life. And by water stocks, I mean to say, for example, a reservoir or an aquifer, which holds water. Water flows can be a river or can be the water through a pipe system. And water insecurity, or water security, like I mentioned, is at the individual and household level, is having enough water of high enough quality to live a good life. And so how are all of these things interrelated is my question. And to address this, I wanted to put this on the screen just to give you a little bit more grounding of what I mean by all of these interconnections. And so we have cultural values and meanings of water. So drinking water or rainwater can mean something different to you than it means to a person who has a rain-fed cistern and uses rainwater to drink. We have human technology relationships. So a reservoir in itself is a type of technology. Pipe systems, cisterns, all impact how we relate to water. And then social, political, and economic relations. So again, these management decisions. When are we going to supply water to one part of the city? Which parts of the city should get more water? I live in the center. And so typically in the Rogizio, which is like the alternating of water days, we have water every other day, whereas if you look at the chart, there are some areas, some regions where they don't have water every other day because they don't have all the industry that is in the center of the city and our neighborhoods in surrounding areas. And then we have the hydrological processes, like I mentioned, evaporation or evapotranspiration, which refers to how plants use water, also rainfall and absorption of water into the soil. And so I wanted to put up my research questions, especially for students in the audience and watching, to see how we can translate this interdisciplinary mess into questions. And then I'm going to go over the methods that I use and then how I'm using the methods to get data to make conclusions. Because a lot of the time we as an academia talk about research, talk about questions, and then no one sees the process. So then you get to come up with your own research question and are stuck because you've never seen the behind the scenes of what it means to actually do research. And so my first question looks at how is water security performed or enacted, both in everyday life and in theater. Then how do technologies mediate different human-water relations? The next question is, how do management strategies help to shape the water stocks, flows, and the lived experience? And finally, how do climate patterns impact these water stocks, flows, and the lived experience? And so in my work, and as an interdisciplinary person or scholar, one difficult aspect sometimes is knowing that things relate and are connected, but knowing that other people don't see those connections. And so you have to come up with a way to explain why things actually make sense. Because in your head, everything makes sense. But then once you say it out loud, nothing makes sense. And I realized that embodiment was a great way to address all of these different facets of my work. So embodiment refers to the lived experience through the body. And so how we, as people, experience the world in this body itself. And so this type of embodiment allows us to look at everyday performance. So you can see two people filling up a 20-liter water bottle with water from a cistern. And that effort, for example, of how much that bucket actually weighs to fill that water up is part of this embodied experience of securing water. And then we have hydrological processes. So you can think about a reservoir embodying both evaporation and other quote-unquote natural processes, and those management processes of how much water is being taken out of the reservoir in order to supply it for a city. And then we have different technologies. So this cistern is a rain-fed cistern, which means that during the rainy season, rooftop water will fall in and fill it up, so that during the dry season, a family can have potable water until the next rainy season. And this can embody, for example, those values of having potable water in the rural area where 20, 25 years ago, that was not the case. And you can see the changes in political dynamics of valuing and really paying attention to populations that are typically invisible in terms of the government. And finally, we have theater performance. And so we'll go into that, I think now. Let's see if, no, I will not go into that now. I was kidding, it will be later. And so thinking about these modes of embodiment, I'm using different methods. And so for the social, and then let's go to this next slide. So there's social science, hydrology, and theater in my work. Where social science, I'm using semi-structured interviews and informal conversations with people, and participant observation, which means like living in people's houses and helping fill up those water bottles. And a survey, come back. And a survey where I visited 52 communities with undergraduate research assistants to ask a specific set of questions about their experience with water, both during the rainy season and the dry season. And then for hydrology, I'm working with the state water management company to measure evaporation rates in municipality reservoirs. And finally, in theater, I'm organizing community-based theater workshops in the communities where I'm working. So now we can go. And so now how to condense these methods into coming up with answers to a question. And so let's go forward a few. Keep going. And so here I've just listed out how for example, my ethnographic methods can answer questions about water stocks, water flows, and insecurity, whereas the survey itself looks at more of this lived experience of water insecurity. And thinking about the rainy and dry season brings it up to how these climate patterns affect the day-to-day lives of people. The evaporation rate analyses also help to understand how these climate patterns impact these different facets. And the community-based theater, through doing exercises and creating scenes where community members think through their water relations and difficulties with water, allows us to understand better what lived memory exists and how water relations have changed from the past into the present. And then finally, I'm using hydrological data from Funceme, the research institute that I work with, and the local water authorities to have some quantitative information to be able to compare and contrast all of these different facets. And now, I wanted to bring in some of the natural science, because I know in the RC, it is like liberal arts focused, and liberal arts does include the sciences. However, we tend to let that go away. Charlie yesterday mentioned that I currently am the first and only BS Chem graduate from the RC. And while there are other people in the natural sciences, typically when I was here in the RC, people would question why I liked chemistry. Fortunately, I had really good friends like Katie and our friend Martha, who were very patient with me and would watch me as I explained a reaction on my whiteboard in my dorm room, and were very interested. And I really appreciated that a lot. And so let's go over a little bit of this evaporation stuff. And so here on the right is a technician from the water company who's creating these supports to put a frame and a tray in that frame to measure evaporation. And I put this on here because the first day that we went out to the reservoir, it was an absolute disaster. And I had tested out my method in a different reservoir when I was on a community visit. I was super pumped. I'm like, yeah, it's going to be great. And then I put those frames into the reservoir, and there's a wave. And then water entered, and it left. And the idea of these evaporation studies is to put water into the tray, so thinking about like an aluminum foil tray, and then measuring after a certain amount of time how much water has evaporated. So if water is entering and leaving, and it's not because of the evaporation, it's not going to work out quite the way we want to. And he came up with this brilliant idea to buy these pallets and to create this system. And we put some pop bottles underneath to help with the buoy system, and then there's an anchor. And so every 2 hours, we would go out in a boat, and I would switch the water out. So I had a container, and I would put that, a container that was empty, put that water into the container, and then put new water in, both which I had measured, had the mass of, and then would measure with a mass balance on the shore how much water had evaporated. Because I also learned that using like a balance or using a scale on a boat doesn't work because the boat moves. These are things that you only learn while doing. And So I'm currently still doing this work and working with my hydrologist on my committee to analyze the data and then to compare it to other ways that people estimate evaporation. And I say estimate and I emphasize it because even though evapotranspiration or evaporation is like one of those key things you learn in like second grade science class, like evaporation, condensation, precipitation. However, it's actually super hard to measure. And just by explaining what I just tried to do, it takes a lot of time. And usually people don't have enough resources or time to be able to do these measurements. And so there are different ways that have been developed to use environmental factors, so thinking about how much sun and how much radiation there is, and wind and temperature, to be able to estimate evaporation, to think about different management strategies. So if we know how much water is evaporating, then we can see how much water, we can project how much water there will be in the future. And so I'm currently working on that, so I can't give you any real conclusions, but I did want to bring this in just to show that in the RC, there can be natural science. Okay, let's go. And so now I put together some slides on one of the communities that I spend a lot of time in to look at how all of these different facets of thinking through ethnographic methods, so that's the interviews and the survey work, and then the hydrological data. So in this case, we're actually measuring water quality. Here is a colleague who's from a different area in Brazil and was working on a different research project with companies from the Netherlands and was interested in getting to know the communities in the region because he was in this particular farm and really wasn't able to get to know what life in the rural area was. And so I invited him to come along. And he had the pH indicator. So pH is the acidity of water. And so we measured how acidic water is. So a pH of 7 is neutral, and in addition to that, we measured conductivity, which is related to the salt concentration. So as I said before, the water is usually highly salinated when you have wells. And I mentioned that right now because in this community, if you read any of these, it used to have a functioning water system for households to have in-house running water with a pipe system. However, because of the actions of the ex-president, that system is no longer being used and is no longer functioning. And in this community, there's a lack of social cohesion. So the families, we had 2 or 3 families that started the community and have sort of formed these nuclei. And there's some conflicts and lack of trust among different families. And so they didn't come up with a collective solution, but rather individual solutions to build individual wells to supply water. However, so you can see in the upper right-hand corner, this family decided to use a pump for a reservoir that is close to them, which is that water in the plastic container. And you can see that that water is not clear. The quality of the water isn't great, but it's better than if you can notice that there's a green plastic thing, and then there's a white line next to it. That white line is from the salt that was from the well that they were using. And these well waters can cause skin irritation, it's corrosive for pipes and for walls, and so they don't really have a solution. However, with that, these cisterns that I mentioned before are essentials because people, even though they don't have high quality water for daily use, they do have potable drinking water. And so let's go to the next slide. And so thinking about water security, most families do have a reliable drinking water source, which are these cisterns. However, like I mentioned, the well water, and so here are 2 examples of wells. They usually have high salt concentrations, which is bad for people's health and also for infrastructure. And the lack of community cohesion and lack of support from the local government have made it very difficult to come up with a collective solution to their water problems. And so there are high levels of water-related stress and worry, but at least for drinking water, the water security is relatively high. And so this is all, so let's go to the next slide. Yeah, so thinking about community cohesion, one aspect that I wanted to bring to this community was community-based theater in order to build a sense of community with the different families and different members of the community. And so in October, I organized this, this workshop with them, which at first they had misunderstood and thought that I was bringing a theater troupe to them. And then I told them, actually, you're the ones doing the theater. And at first, people were a little reticent and hesitant to engage. However, there was this one man who is this one with the bucket, with one of the warm-up exercises, just like jumped in and got into it, and I was so excited because he really changed the dynamic. And so as part of the workshop, I had them devise scenes where they thought about water challenges in their community, and I wanted to just show you a part of one of the scenes where they are getting water from a reservoir. So they have a donkey, its name is Tapioca, and before having piped running water, people typically went 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers, or more to a reservoir to collect water to bring back to their houses for all of their uses. And so let's run this. And so he is using a bucket. You can imagine that there's a reservoir there, and he's filling up that casket with water. And then after it's full, they will take it off. So let's imagine, so Tapioca really didn't like the ceramic, so he didn't want to come up. So they're taking off these caskets to then fill up the water in their household. And I will be telling the community that this is being played right now, because at first I didn't record anything of the workshop. I didn't want people to worry or feel intimidated because I was recording. And then their response was, but why aren't you recording? You need to record. And so then we did. And so that was just a snippet from one of the groups. So let's keep going. And so thinking about, in general, water security and Keisha and well-being, let's put up those bullet points. So one. So as I meant, community structure is super important in securing water for a community, especially when the community itself is managing their water source. Like in the case of this community where they lacked this cohesion and had problems with the president, and that resulted in having a system that didn't work. And however, overall, rural water security has increased over the past 20 years, particularly because of public programs, such as the building of cisterns, and also programs that have created water towers and set up these locally managed water systems at the community level. And in general, water security is relative. So the lived experience and memory of people affect how secure they feel with their water. For example, these community members here have that lived experience of going to that reservoir, having to go every single day to fill up those caskets to bring back to their house. And so now having in-house water, even if it's that reservoir water that we saw that was not quite clear, a little yellowish, that is so much better than what they're used to in the past. And so there's different sense of what is security in terms of having water. They have water, the quality isn't the greatest, but they don't have to go and spend half of their day to look for water. And this is all fine and good, but in my work, and also when I was in undergrad and after undergrad and into my PhD, I had this question of why am I doing what I do? Sure, it's fun to measure things and do reactions or talk to people, but why? And with work that was with the US Army Corps of Engineers and my lab mates and my advisor, we started looking at equity in terms of water infrastructure. And once we started this project, it came to me. I was like, oh, okay. So really, what are we looking for? We're looking for making a better world. And with an equity and a justice lens, that's how you do it. In terms of interdisciplinarity is cool because you get to see all these aspects. But if you don't have this consideration for inequities or why some people start off in an unequal place because of systemic oppression and how we can change those systems, then the interdisciplinary work that I do, that you do, it may not have the impact that we would want, because we need to focus on where those issues in those systems are to be able to change them. And so equity in itself is not equality, but rather, because equality looks at the sameness, so thinking everyone starts at the same and providing them the same help, whereas equity looks at difference. For example, I like to use the example of a bicycle. And so you can think about a normal bicycle that we have every day. And that bicycle is great for a person who's like probably of my height and is able-bodied. However, a person who is in a wheelchair won't be able to use that bike. And a person who is like a child or really tall won't be able to either. So if we think about justice as participation, parity and participation in social life, and that social life being able to ride a bike, then giving everyone the same bike doesn't give everyone that ability to participate. And so we have to think about those differences and those different needs in order to create a more just society where people can participate. And there are three different facets of equity. We have distributional equity, which thinks about the distribution of harms and benefits and like the physical resources. So thinking about water as a physical resource, how is water distributed? Procedural equity refers to decision-making processes. Who's at the table? What shape is the table? How high is the table? Should we even have a table? And recognitional equity, which is the recognition that there are social differences and different ways that people relate to the world, understand the world, and how all of those, how coming up or thinking through these three different facets of equity allow us to address the historical oppression of particular groups in order to create more just futures. So in terms of equity and water security in Cearense, let's just add those. We can think about different aspects of equity. So at the community level, there's a diversity of situations. We looked at one today. And there's usually a lack of engagement by the government to understand needs. And so this deals with recognitional and procedural equity. Then we have water dynamics at the household level are also typically invisible at higher levels of management. So thinking again about recognitional equity, and then distributional equity, because without having this recognitional equity, where people don't have access to water can't be addressed. And so in general, in order to create greater equity and water justice, we really need to look at those local situations and be grounded in our work. So let's keep going. And so I just have a couple, oh yeah, cool. Okay, so I've used this word a lot, interdisciplinarity, and I put this up. There are a couple definitions of what multidisciplinarity is, what being interdisciplinary is, and what transdisciplinary is. And I put this up here just to show that definitions can be very useful. So interdisciplinarity is the bringing together of different perspectives to work on a problem. However, definitions are not the be-all, end-all. So while it's helpful to see that there are different words that are used to describe having all these different interests and disciplines, it's not necessary to get caught up in what these definitions are to define yourself. So let's go on. However, as I was doing some research for this presentation, I learned that the idea of a hard and soft science or discipline was developed in the 1970s by researchers, and Bigman and others worked with 2 universities to ask professors the similarities and differences among different disciplines. And he came up with this chart. And so I have my disciplines, here, anthropology, hydrology, philosophy, and theater. And we're sort of, I think I want to go a little faster. So if you can click 1, 2, 3, cool. So according to this chart, anthropology is a soft discipline, which means that there's not a lot of consensus of how people think about the world. It's a pure science, which focuses less on the applied aspect, working with communities, and is a life science, which means that it's concerned with living organisms, that is to say people. However, just looking at these definitions, I don't really agree, because my work is really applied. And so according to this chart and according to these scholars, my work as an anthropologist doesn't really fit into this confined definitions. And so just quickly, what do you guys think theater and performance would be in this scheme? Anyone? Oh yeah, you have to think though. Okay, so I'll give you time to think. Oh, he put it up there. So it's not actually there. So theater and the arts was not considered in any of these studies. which is interesting because, for example, in my PhD program, the arts, theater is also not considered an interdisciplinary, integrative conservation research. So let's go on. And so now I have a choice for you to choose your own adventure. Either I'm going to talk about performance as presentation or exploring research as craft, which are two performance-based interdisciplinary things. So who has a strong opinion, or should we do hands? Research as craft? Okay, so let's go a few slides. Keep going, keep going. Okay, research as craft. This one is very cool. And it relates a lot to my undergraduate work. And it relates to, I probably won't have time to get to the anecdotes, so we're gonna bring in one of the anecdotes now, which is a shout out to the writing group and having grant writing as speculative fiction. So speculative fiction is writing realities that don't exist. And I have come up with this vision of writing scholarship applications, grant applications, as a type of speculative fiction where I'm writing ideas that I want to exist. I don't even know how they can exist, but they should exist. And then someone should give me funding to be able to pursue these ideas that, in a very nice written grant, it seems like I already know how this is going to happen, which I don't. This was the case for exploring research as craft. For the National Science Foundation, they have a graduate research fellowship, and you have to write a personal statement and a research statement. For the personal statement, I wrote that I had applied to a small grant at the University of Georgia, and ICE is not that ICE. It is a creative expression. It's I think the Institute of Creative Expressions, but I think I'm wrong. Anyway, so they had a grant that was like, hey everyone, we want to support projects that increase communication in the academic community and with the broader community. I'm like, cool, that's awesome. So in my proposal or my statement for the GRFP, the Graduate Research Fellowship, I wrote that I had applied for the grant to have a workshop collaborating with a performance artist to use theater in order to increase communication among different disciplines at UGA. Mind you, so I had this idea. I still hadn't applied for the grant yet because the due date wasn't, when I was writing, it hadn't been the due date, but once people were reading this, I would have applied. Also, I didn't have that collaborator yet. So my artist was this unknown person. Then after I submitted this, at dinner with a couple of friends, I meet Alden. Alden becomes this artist. They are a multimodal visual artist based in Athens, and when I met them, I knew instantly that this was the person who was going to do this work with me. And so I was like, hey, do you want to do this workshop where we look at research and process and all of these things? And they're like, sure. And so I think I cut some slides. So I will talk about this more now. This idea of process. So in this exploring research as craft, the idea is taking research and not focusing on the end result, not focusing on the paper that you publish, not focusing on that nice chart that you've made, not focusing on those findings. It's focusing on the process of doing all of those steps. What do you have to create in order to create that chart? So as a chemistry student, I had a lot of test tubes and did a lot of studies where just a lot of vials. I had lots of vials. And I actually took photos of these. Can you go to a slide? Okay, so I don't have it. So you can look at these pretty pictures instead. And just in that image of what am I creating in the process of creating, I wanted to explore that more. And that's where this idea of exploring research as a craft, as a skill, comes to be. And Alden, as a multimodal artist, brought in the idea of the materiality of the elements that you're using. So for example, in my chemistry lab, how the spatula that I use felt when I would use the substrate, the chemical that I made, and measured 0.5 milligrams into a vial to do a reaction. Those visceral embodied experiences of materiality. So we took these two ideas of looking at the process of research and also looking at artistic work as a process to do research. So Alden, in their work, uses visual media and the artistic work that they create, and then to explore different topics as an act of research. And so you have this interplay. And then we wrote the grant and got support from the university to bring together students, PhD students from across the entire campus, from the fine arts, from anthropology, from ecology, from English, and from biology, to explore these two ideas, and ended up doing a pop-up gallery show in a local gallery in Athens, Georgia, where people were able to walk through the gallery and experience all of these different pieces. In my case, I did a performance-based piece where I was a researcher and used the Pomodoro method. So Pomodoro method is that you have 25 minutes of work and then 5 minutes of rest. I split that up into 5-minute increments where in the background you could hear me typing, and every 5 minutes the sound accumulated and I changed clothing and I changed the position where I was. So I was first at my desk, and then I was laying on the ground, and then in a different position, and those last 5 minutes, there was silence, and I rested. And I repeated this over and over again throughout the gallery, which was exploring this process of what it means to do research. I have to read a lot of articles, and that was a way for me to perform the process of creating knowledge. And so this is a picture from that, and this is this lovely interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary crazy group. And later, Katie and I are gonna work on a way to get some of the videos that I wanted to show but don't have enough time to online so that you can check out all of these cool things later, like performance as presentation. And so we have about 5 minutes until 5. And so at this point, I want to open it up a little and have you ask questions, or I can tell more anecdotes, whatever you guys want to do now. So thank you.
We do have time for a couple of questions at least.
We have our lovely runner.
What a wonderful talk. Thank you. I was wondering about the theater you did with the donkey and the pouring of the water and so forth. What followed? Was there conversation? How was it integrated within the community discussion about the technologies and such?
And so that's an excellent question. So the question was about how, with these different scenes that the different groups did, how that created more community conversation. And so with the workshop, what happened was each group worked alone and developed their scene, and then all of the groups watched as the one performed. And so then after that, we came around in a circle to talk about how water relationships have changed in this community. So in the example with the donkey, that was before having running water. There was another group that did work, that did a scene that relates the quality of the water in the wells in the current situation where it's poor quality water. And within the group, these different shared experiences resonated with everyone. And so everyone, you couldn't really hear it in the audio, but even during the scene itself, people were laughing, people were engaged with their own experiences that they have. And so that in itself, and then everyone really relating to the water quality of the wells is really horrible, brought together the sense of shared experience that hopefully will help build more community within the group. And with this community particularly, I'll be having 2 more workshops. One is actually with water institutions in the city, and then bringing that group to this community so that the 2 groups can do this theater workshop together and then have this shared experience to be able to work together to solve the water issues of the community itself. Yes, in the back.
Kind of running on the same refrain. Is there any meaningful scene that was ever produced that really stuck with you as you were doing the research, any scene that really like brought, I mean, you talked about one that really brought people together, but was there any scene that like really stuck out to you or really like touched you in a way?
For the theater work?
For the theater work, yeah.
So I've only done one theater workshop. And so I would say that this scene, or that scene with the donkey really stuck out because thinking back, really one of the questions that I have to ask myself as an American researcher is they were, in a sense, thinking what I should know. And one of the community members even said, like, you need, like, you know, like, you should, like, you need to know these things, and, like, you need to record this to share this with other people. And so that comment of the community members being very aware that what they were doing in itself can communicate their lived experience to others, myself included, as this researcher who is trying to understand the local situations and work with both the community and the local authorities to change these situations, really stuck with me of, wow, this is what people want me to know so that I, as a, you know, an outsider, can understand their situation.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And so if we can skip like lots of slides, because I have lots of slides. Keep going. Oh yeah, so, and then this is a theater performance in Madrid, my first year. That is me. It was like absurd comedy where we took Divinas Palabras, or Divine Words, by a Spanish artist or playwright, and did this performance. And so it was a little anecdote of how I got into that. Let's just skip to the beginning. Okay, so I really just wanted to make this point that interdisciplinarity, making connections among all of these different ways of thinking and being, and a focus on equity and justice are key to addressing these complex socio-natural problems that we are facing today and will face into the future. And so as students, as scholars, to think about not only how to incorporate different ways of thinking, but then also how these can relate to a more just society is really key into addressing all of the current contemporary, historical, contemporary, and future aspects of climate change, of water access, of all of these different socio-natural, both social and natural problems that we face as a society. So thanks.